Thanks, Evan, and lovely to be here today speaking to you all. My name is Richard Chataway. I'll give you a bit more of my background in a moment, an introduction. But today I'm going to be talking to you about what I call the behavior business, in particular, creating finance experiences that work for humans as well as for AI. And to give you that introduction to myself, I'm Global Director of Behavioral Science at Concentrix. I'll talk more about Concentrix in a moment and what we do. But as you can see on screen now, I wrote a book that came out in 2020 called The Behaviour Business, all about applying behavioural science for business success. And it covers lots of topic areas in which behavioural science can be applied, everything from building digital products and services to customer insights, customer experience, marketing, and recruitment, assessment, and performance management. But there was actually a large section in my book that talks about AI. And bearing in mind that this came out 5 years ago in 2020, at the time, a few people did ask questions about why I included that and whether it was particularly relevant to business at that point. And I guess it's, somewhat gratifying to see that, that in the last 5 years, we've seen increasing use of AI-based tools. And so that part of the book is increased in relevance. But also that we have those tools have moved on significantly, but actually the core fundamentals of how they influence human behavior haven't changed. The opening line of my book is, if you're in business, you're in the business of behavior. And what I mean by that is that in order to achieve impact within business, we typically need people who currently do X to do Y, or to stop doing X, or do more of X, which are all behavior changes. There is either behaviors of your customers or your employees. And because behavioral science gives us the framework and the understanding of how and why people do what they do, that has relevance to all of these challenges that businesses face. And so that's what I want to talk a bit more about with you today. And in terms of my background experience and knowledge around behavioral science, I guess I've been working in applied behavioral science for about 20 years or so, though that wasn't necessarily what I knew I was doing at the time when I started working in the field. About 20 years ago, I started working for the Department of Health here in the UK, creating and managing behavior change campaigns around encouraging people to quit smoking. And those were, at the start, were majority scary ads with things like diseased lungs and really graphic imagery designed to scare people away from the dangers and risks of cigarette smoking. But actually, over time, we started bringing a lot of insights from social psychology, what was then also called social marketing, what we now collectively tend to know as behavioral science, which is the study and use of disciplines like social psychology, experimental psychology, behavioral economics, and so on. And that had two really, major impacts for me personally. One was that I found it fascinating and hugely insightful, and decided that was where I wanted to sort of focus my career from then on. But the second thing was it was transformative for the work that we were doing at the Department of Health. We achieved the government's targets around smoking rates and numbers of people quitting smoking successfully a year early. And it completely changed the nature of the work that we were doing. And over time, I then went to work for a central government in the UK and led communication strategy for government in Australia, working with the federal government there as well as the government of New South Wales, and bringing a lot of this best practice and understanding around behaviour change and behavioural science to influence behaviour of citizens successfully, in not just in public health, but areas like taxation, recruitment for the armed forces, climate change, etc. But I came to the realization that actually this is very underused in the private sector, and there's huge opportunities within that. And so I led a behavioural science practice at Ogilvy, working with Rory Sutherland, who many of you will know, who's a real champion and advocate of behavioural science and its applications, particularly in advertising and marketing. And Rory wrote the foreword to my book, and then set up my own business called CSG, specialising in applications to customer experience, customer communications. And that led me to come and work at Concentrix and build our behaviour change capabilities within the business. And I've been here for about 3 years. And I'm going to talk a bit more about some of the work we do at Concentrix today. But to give you an idea, just a little bit of brief background to Concentrix and who we are. As you can see here, we have over 2,000 clients globally. We work in over 70 countries. And so we have a truly global scale, but we like to have a very local touch in terms of working closely with local clients to make sure it's tailored to their culture and their market, but benefiting from global innovation investment. And what we are is an intelligent transformation partner. So, as it says here, we are solution focused, tech powered, and intelligence fueled. And really, that's the part that I want to focus on today, an intelligence fueled part of it, and particularly how we use that understanding of human behavior of your customers to deliver better outcomes. And you'll see we work across many verticals globally, including banking, financial services, and insurance, and have a lot of experience there. So what is the relevance of behavioral science in terms of thinking about those customer experiences and how we deliver those better experiences? So, human behavior or behavioral science is all about understanding how people make decisions and how they make choices in the real world. And so the choices that those customers make are more important than ever. And if you think about in terms of how customers choose to engage with you and your products and services, that could be about which service providers they use. It could be about whether they use a self-service solution or they call your contact center. It could be about how and if they complete a purchase journey. And it could be about if they're making contact to clarify information, or they just want to understand the features, risks, and conditions of a particular product or service. These are all choices that they're making. They're all behaviors, and therefore behavioral science can add value in terms of how we address each of those. And if we can influence those choices in ways that benefit those customers, but also benefit the organization and the clients we work for, that will increase the impact on the company's bottom line. So how can we better influence those decisions? And that is where behavioral science comes into its own. And one of the things, that we've learned from behavioral science, and I like to say, we've learned more about human behavior in the last 50 years than we have in the previous 5,000 years. It's that most decisions that we make on a daily basis, whether it's customers or employees, are largely subconscious and instinctive. And those include decisions that we make about our finances. So if we're making decisions about our families and our homes, about the products and services that we buy, and how we invest, spend, and save our money, they are very strongly influenced by uniquely human traits like liking, trust, fear, laziness, and peer pressure. And, those are just colloquial terms for what in the behavioral science world we categorize as behavioral biases or heuristics, mental rules of thumb that we use to make decisions. But they're hugely powerful, hugely influential, and often underestimated in their impact. And I'm not going to talk too much about the science behind this. This is a conference about behavioral finance, and many of you will be familiar with some of the key concepts. And if you've read, books like Thinking Fast and Slow or Nudge, you'll be familiar with the fundamentals. But I guess one thing I wanted to talk about was in terms of, how we often categorize that distinction between system 1 and system 2 behavior. And the analogy that Thaler and Sunstein draw in their book Nudge about Homer versus Spock. And what's really critical about that distinction and that understanding, controversial as it can be, because, most decisions don't tend to be as binary as that in terms of that system 1 and system 2 distinction, is that what behavioral science tells us is how you say something is as important as what you are saying. And what that means is just giving people information, just saying do this or don't do that is often not enough to change our habits. And we have these, Homer-like behaviors that we are prone to. We often behave in instinctive, often irrational, non-systematic ways in our behavior, in contrast to, what in Thaler and Sunstein categorizes as our Spock-like behaviors, the system 1 and system 2 distinction. So system 1 behaviors being more automatic, uncontrolled, effortless, emotional, non-conscious, and fast, versus system 2 being more reflective, controlled, effortful, deductive, self-aware, and slow. And in a financial context, you might think of system 1 decisions as being, sometimes, if we're making low value, low risk decisions, we might go on gut feel. We have a good feeling about a particular investment, for example, that is going to gain value. Whereas a system 2 decision might be about, pension providers and provisions. We might sit down and go through all the different options in detail between the two. As I say, it's often not as binary distinction. But what we do know is that we underestimate how often people are in that system one mode and behaving in those Homer-like ways. But the other thing that's really important that I'll come on to talk about today is that when we think about how we use automated tools, how we use chatbots, how we use generative AI, they can only operate in system 2 mode. Daniel Kahneman had a great quote that he used to use around this, which is the difference between a human and an algorithm is that if you feed the same data to an algorithm twice, you'll get the same answer. This is not true of humans. And so when we think about algorithmic-based tools, which any kind of AI is, it's fueled by algorithms, and algorithms are simply rules, is that they will consistently apply those rules, and they will be governed by those. And those rules, the outputs are only as good as those rules are, and whether those rules have taken into account the biases that influence human behavior, because our customers, for the time being at least, remain humans. And so we need to be cognizant of those biases to influence behavior. So what I want to talk about now for the next few minutes is some of the ways in which we can influence behavior with that recognition of some of their biases in a finance context. And then come on to talk about the implications for how we then start using these kind of automated tools and generative AI. So at Concentrix, there's a framework that we have we call Cognition, which is one that I developed in my business CSG some years ago, and we've applied in well over 100 client engagements now using what we call a cognition audit. To drive customer success and success in customer engagement. And, there's an old saying, which is that, all frameworks are wrong, but some of them are useful. And, in terms of our framework, we find it particularly useful in this context because not only does it synthesize some of the over 200 different behavioral biases and heuristics that have influenced customer behavior, but also it brings into play a lot of principles from communications planning and the most effective ways in which we can engage and communicate with customers. And that's, with my background working in communications and marketing for a number of years. And we have these 9 cogs, as we call them, which those of you familiar with behavioral science will recognize some of the concepts here, like social norms, commitment bias, etc., that are reflected in these cogs. But also, they are very, very useful as kind of touchstones and reference points when we're conducting training with customer-facing staff. And a really critical aspect of what we do is it's really critical that when people are using behavioral nudges or interventions to engage with customers, we don't just give them a script and say this. It's really important they understand the why as well as the how. So our team are very skilled in training in these techniques and tools with customer-facing staff. We've trained thousands of staff now, not only in the Concentrix business, but also in client businesses, with using these techniques. And I'm going to share a couple of examples of how that can be used now and how we can make those human-to-human interactions more effective using applied behavioral science. So this first example, which from some work we did with a bank here in the UK, and this bank wanted to encourage people to make better use of their self-service tools, particularly their customer website. They created this customer website. There were some issues with the website around its usability, which we also addressed through a separate project to make it more usable and more user-friendly. But also a lot of customers were persistently calling their contact center with queries that could be or objectives and jobs to be done that could be much more effectively done through the website and more quickly and more effectively for them as a customer. But also, obviously, that meant that there were in demands on their contact center, which led to long wait times and meant that those who had specific needs that could only be addressed at the contact center were often not getting those addressed as effectively as possible. And when we did our cognition audit with this contact center and we listened to calls and we went through the scripting and language that was being used, we found that a lot of calls were being closed with a statement a bit like this: if you have any more problems, you can call us anytime. We're here 24/7. Now, the issue with this as a statement is it's priming the behavior for the next time the customer needs to contact them to call in the first instance, which obviously wasn't necessarily the right thing to do for them or for the bank. So we created new scripts and training, and part of that was to encourage them to close the call by using a phrasing a bit like this: you can find the answers to most problems on our website. And you can always call us back if you need to. We're here 24/7. Now, this framing is much more effective because what it's doing is it's categorizing the default behavior and framing the default behavior for a customer to go to the website first. And if you can't get what you need from the website, then call us back. It's really important to say the contact center and the phone line is there if people need it, because there are some circumstances where people will need it and some people are unable to use the website for whatever reason. But rather than just remove that as an option for customers, that would be lead to a lot of detraction, customers to detract and have negative experiences of the brand. But the framing of it as the default option, leveraging this default cog as we call it, proved to be much more effective. Another thing that we did with the contact center was we found that quite often, during the conversation, a contact center advisor would prompt the customer to say, "Oh, did you know you can do this through the website, or are you aware you can do this particular task online?" And this was a bank which had quite an old customer base. There were a lot of customers who maybe weren't digitally native, weren't as comfortable transacting online, may have had concerns about security, for example. And so, quite often they would say no, either I wasn't aware or they weren't willing to do it. And the thing was that quite often agents would just take a straight no as an answer and then move on and not even attempt then to nudge them into the digital channel. So what we did was, again, we trained and coached them and created a new scripting to say something like, for example, if you're not comfortable using a website, I'm more than happy to show you how easy it is. And then what they could then do was walk through the process, the relevant process on the website with the customer on the phone to show them and demonstrate for them that they could do this online and to build their confidence capability in achieving that outcome. And this was, this in combination with the nudge I just described and the many other nudges we introduced for this bank, actually overall achieved a 14% reduction in future calls. We were able to look at the calls where these nudges were used and then track the customer's use of the contact channels subsequently. And we found over the next 90 days, 14% of them went to the website rather than what they were calling as they would have done previously. So it achieved a really significant impact. Bear in mind, this is a bank with 20 million plus customers in the UK. And this is an example of what we call our ability cog in our framework. We provided tools to increase the ability of the user, increase the belief of the user in their ability to change and their likelihood to do so. In behavioral science, we would often talk about this in terms of self-efficacy. If I feel confident achieving an outcome, I'm more likely to try and do it. So this is just a couple of examples of how in these interactions we can use behavioral science more effectively to change behavior and achieve positive win-win outcomes both for customers and for organizations. And so, we've got a great database and evidence base of work that we've done that creates solutions that work for humans. And where we can use these nudge techniques, if you want to call them that, to achieve really positive business effects. So, we worked with a credit card company. They found that they were very successful at driving people through to their website, but actually there was a very high bounce rate and people wouldn't then go through to make an application for a credit card. What we did was we did a cognition audit of the site. We recommended removing a lot of frankly extraneous information that people saw before they saw the apply online button. We changed the color and the wording of that apply online button, and it increased click-through by 54%, which we tested through an A/B test of the old website versus the new website. We also were able to reduce handling time, or AHT, for another financial services organization and what was interesting about this was that we knew if we went to the advisors in the contact center and said, we need you to be making your calls shorter, that would drive a lot of bad behavior, frankly, because it would encourage people to speak too quickly or to drop difficult calls. And again, there was an issue around handling the amount of demand on the contact center because calls were taking longer than they needed to. But also there was a lot of failure demand. That was customers were having to repeatedly call about the same issue at the contact center, which is bad for the customer, but also bad for the business and their productivity. So what we did was we created new scripts and structures, which was designed to ensure that they could achieve a positive outcome, but more efficiently and more quickly. And then we coached and trained that into the agents in the contact center. And that reduced average handling time by 11%. Again, for a very large bank. So that a very, very significant business saving for them in the millions of pounds. But also, interestingly, customer satisfaction improved as a result of it, because no one likes spending more time on the phone to the bank than they absolutely have to. Next example, again, this is the channel shift example that I've just talked to. One other interesting aspect of that was and how we achieved this 14% channel shift from telephone to online and use of their digital products and services, was that we had to change the behaviour of the advisors as well, because they were often reluctant to recommend the website to customers. And that was an example of what we would call survivorship bias. Basically, they only heard calls from people who'd gone to the website and said, "Oh, I didn't get what I needed from the website today, so I'm calling you instead." And that wasn't representative of most customers. 93% of customers would actually go to the website, achieve what they wanted, and then just be able to get on with the rest of the day. So they'd never call the contact center. Now, but obviously the advisors had never heard from those customers, so they were biased because of the data they did have, which was from customers who had a bad experience with the website. So part of the training we did was to demonstrate that, to give them, use survivorship bias as an example, and say to them, actually, the website works great for most people, so you should feel comfortable and confident in recommending it to customers to use. And as I say, overall, that led to a 14% channel shift. And then the last example I want to talk to here is about retention. So this was working with a roadside breakdown cover provider. They had a subscription annual, renewal model and they were struggling to retain customers. There was about 20% of customers were at risk of lapsing every year. And what we discovered through our cognition audit was that customers were receiving a renewal quote every year. That was typically more than they were paying that current year. What they would do is they would then go online, look at a few different other providers, see that it gets some competitive quotes, then call the contact center and say, "Look, you give me this renewal quote. I've got a better quote online from another provider. What can you do for me?" And it was encouraging a kind of haggling situation between the agents and the customer until they provide a level of discounting that the customer was happy to pay that amount. But also that was obviously reducing margin for the provider as well. And, they were got such into this, into this mindset around how the annual renewal process would work, that the opening line they were using when customers call in was say, "Thank you for calling today. Are you looking for a better deal on your breakdown cover?" Now, who's going to say no to that? That's a question. And it's obviously framing it exactly in that kind of deals mindset. And what we did with the scripts was we removed that part of the scripting and made it more neutral framing, but also we structured it to be more about meeting the customer needs rather than providing with the deal. And that led to three things. One was that their retention rate improved by 10%. The second was that, which we assessed through a pilot, the second thing was that customers would generally accept a slightly higher offer in terms of the price they're willing to pay, because if they felt it was better to meet their needs, so margin was increased for the business. And the third thing which was an unexpected benefit, if I'm honest, was that the absentee rates from the contact center were reduced very significantly, and that was because the agents were having better, more productive, more pleasant conversations with customers, which was less stressful for them, led to fewer of them calling in sick or having other issues, and generally, made it a better place to work. So, this was all, positive benefits in addition to the pure bottom line benefit of a 10% increase in retention. So this goes to show that there's really powerful effects and benefits that we can deliver through applied behavioral science in human-to-human interactions and those contexts. What I want to talk about for the rest of this session is about, now we're moving to a world where increasingly those interactions will be automated or making use of Gen AI-based tools. What does that mean? And how can we make sure that we're not losing that human element and losing that understanding of human behavior in how we apply and use this technology so we can do it more effectively? Because as I say, whatever else may change in terms of technology, your customers remain humans with all the irrationalities and biases that means, the implications of that. So, first thing to mention, this is something that I talked about in my book. We're already interacting with AI quite extensively on a daily basis, but most of that is not generative AI. The Australian academic Joshua Cans coined a great term of prediction machines. This is where we're trying to use algorithms to change behavior and predict behavior. So a classic example that you'll be familiar with is the recommendation engine on Netflix. So the version of Netflix that I see versus the version that every one of you see will be different because it is tailored, and the recommendations and the program it thinks that I will like, the shows and movies it thinks I will like, will be tailored to me and my preferences. And they have a complex algorithm that creates these taste groups to do that. And it's based on individual user behavior, but also the behavior of all users of Netflix, all users of a particular type of Netflix. Now, the thing about this is, one, it works really well. So 75% of all the content watched on Netflix is driven by these recommendation engines. In the same way, the recommendation engine on Amazon is responsible for about 25% of all the purchases. So other items that people have bought, once you buy something on Amazon, it says, would you consider buying these other things, or other people have bought these things? That drives 25% of all purchases there. And those are relatively simple, low consequence choices. If I start watching a show I don't like on Netflix, I can stop watching and watch something else. And it's providing value to me. It's solving the paradox of choice problem, which is there are thousands of things to watch, available to watch. And I if there are too many, it's overwhelming, and I'll switch off the TV and do something else instead. But it's not generative AI. It's a simple algorithm that is predicting future behavior. And we now live in a world, we've got a new chapter in automation, but as I say, humans remain human. So we're now combining these capabilities of artificial intelligence in terms of analysis of data, recognizing patterns, making predictions, with RPA, robot process automation, where we're automating repetitive and tasks and rule-based tasks, and it allows us to create bots with generative AI. And this is where we can now create content like images, text, and music based on patterns and examples it's learned. And every week we're seeing new examples of phenomenal content that's being created through these tools that is mind-blowing and often indistinguishable from what we might have been able to create through human endeavor in the past. And this includes large language models like ChatGPT. But the thing is, what's common across all of these, whether it's what you might call narrow AI or generative AI, is that all forms of this automation rely on the quality of the data that it's learning from, the inputs they receive, so in the context of an LLM, the prompts that you're using, and the governance, the execution. As I say, how you say something is important as what you're saying. So what do the outputs look like that we then use? And behavioral science is critical in understanding all of this. So I'm going to touch on the data quality and governance problems in a bit more detail. And you may be familiar with a phrase that's used in the technology world a lot, which is garbage in, garbage out. What that means is that all data that humans touch contains bias and contains the human biases that we are all prone to and that we use to navigate the world and lead us to make often irrational and sometimes suboptimal decisions. And so, when tools are being built, learning from this data, all you're doing is automating, magnifying those biases in a lot of contexts. So, some of these examples are pretty scary. So one example is with driverless cars. One of the reasons why we've not seen proliferation and mass adoption and usage of driverless cars so far is that the training data they've been used is heavily biased, to the extent whereby studies have shown that you are more likely to be run over by a driverless car if you are non-white or a child, because the training data, which is largely from the streets of Northern California, is heavily biased towards white adults. And so, that is a very negative outcome from the use of these tools, and something that the training data needs to be adapted in order to make sure those biases are trained out of the system. In a less serious way, but one that can have significant business reputational damage. We've seen a number of businesses who've attempted to create chatbots using unring-fenced data or versions of white-labeled versions of ChatGPT, for example. And in this example from the delivery company DPD in the UK, What they quickly found, or what users quickly found, was that they could encourage it to swear in their responses to them and write haikus about how useless DPD are. Now, obviously, that's a terrible outcome for them from a reputation and PR perspective, and it was covered in all the major news outlets. But it was also because, they hadn't thought about the data that was being used and the inputs that were being used to train this bot. And users were quickly able to exploit that. So that's the data quality side of things. What about the governance side? So what about the outputs and how we as human users, as customers, respond to the outputs of any of these AI-based tools? And one thing that I think has moved on a lot since my book was written, for example, I say that the conclusions of my book around AI and how we use it and the challenges in terms of data quality and governance are the same, but the use cases and the evidence base we have has increased significantly over the last 5 years because we've had these new tools like LLMs available to us. But the nature of a human-to-human interaction is intrinsically different to a human-to-bot interaction. So, to give you an example, if this talk that I'm delivering to you today were being delivered by a bot, or even an avatar version of me, rather than me sitting here recording this now, you would respond to it differently, even if the content were word for the word the same, because the biases that govern our human-to-human interactions are different to the biases that govern our human-to-AI interactions or human-to-bot interactions. And one impact that's hugely significant for the world of finance is that we are more likely to lie and be fraudulent when we are interacting with an automated or AI-based tool than if we're interacting with a human. And there are several studies that have demonstrated this, and this is one of the clearest ones. So this was a study conducted in China where they asked, in the first scenario, participants in the study had to predict a number between 1 and 10. And they had to predict a number that was being chosen either by a human or an AI. And they were told whether it was a human or an AI was choosing it. And so you predict your number, then they revealed what the number that had been chosen was, and then you said how accurate your guess was. So critically, there was the opportunity to lie about the accuracy of your guess. Now, the answer was always 8. But, the sample was big enough that statistically, the average guess by people who responded should have been about 5 because it's totally random. There's no other information that would inform your guesswork here. And what they found was that when they were told the answer was 8, people thought they were guessing what a human had selected. On average, they said it was about 6, so people lied a little bit. And then when they thought they were guessing against a bot, they lied a bit more. They said 6.9 was the average accuracy of the guess, or the average guess, sorry. So, intrinsically, people were more likely to lie a bit more if they thought they were interacting with a bot. What's interesting is that when you start putting some financial gain into the scenario, the numbers change quite significantly. So in this case, they created another scenario where there was effectively the opportunity for financial gain through committing some relatively low-level fraud. So the scenario was that you bought some clothing items online, you wanted to return them because they didn't fit or you didn't like them. But the only way to regain your shipping fee for those items, which was relatively low value, was to lie about and say there was a fault with the items. And again, same scenario, you either interacted with a human agent or a bot. And when people were interacting with a human, in 12% of circumstances, they lied to avoid that shipping fee. So they lied, just over 1 in 10 people would lie to get their shipping fee back. When they were interacting with a bot, 62% of people lied to avoid that shipping fee. So 50% more of people committed a low-level fraud because they felt that they could get away with it when interacting with a bot. So this is hugely important, particularly in the financial world, where the risks of fraud are significant. And so, as I say, the last 5 years, we've now moved to a scenario where we've got a lot more evidence base around how behavioral science can help us determine when the best solution is a human or a bot in these interactions. And there's been great work done by like Thomas McKinley, Stefano Prantoni, and colleagues from the Wharton Business School about what the existing research shows us and when it's more effective to use a human or an AI. And we're potentially partnering with them to conduct some of our own research to look at some of these impacts in future. But I wanted to share with you just as a final few remarks around those use cases and what the evidence base is showing us as we currently stand. And the reality is that the overall summary is that the science says AI should assist and not replace human agents. And it should be that combination of the two, because they both do different things and they both do them in some cases the AI is better at doing certain things, in some cases the humans are better at doing certain things. And so it's in combination that we can achieve the most positive impacts on customer experience. So some examples. Relatively simple problems, AI is often better at doing that because it can do it more quickly and more effectively. Or a bot can do it more quickly, more effectively. When we have complex, nuanced problems, humans are still much better at that. And part of the reason for that is that people perceive human agents as warmer and more competent for complex issues because we're expected to feel and show empathy. We don't have that expectation of chatbots. They're very efficient for simple tasks, but they lack the emotional intelligence required for scenarios involving emotional interactions. So people will trust them better for routine tasks, but as soon as there's any degree of complexity, humans are better able to meet those needs. If you're handling a rejection or giving an unfavorable offer to a customer, say a price increase, for example, bots are often better for those for similar kind of reasons. Whereas if we're giving favorable decisions or generous offers, people prefer to get those from humans. We tend to think favorable decisions are thanks to our own merits. In the example of what in behavioral science we call the fundamental attribution error. So if we get a favorable decision, we're being offered a benefit or something for free, we think it's because we're great, basically. But when something happens negatively, we tend to think it's for external reasons out of our control. So we get rejected for a job. We go, they already knew who they wanted to hire, or it was nothing to do with our own capability and competency. And because humans are seen as more likely to recognize our own individual merits, while AI and algorithms are seen as relying on standardized criteria that have nothing to do with our individual merits, that's why they're better at handling the negative information, the bad news, if you like, rather than humans. When we think about privacy and objectivity, interestingly, when we need to gather sensitive information from customers, AI bots tend to be better for that. Whereas, as we've seen in the example I've just shared, when there's fraud risks, then it's better to go through a human. We perceive AI as neutral and non-judgmental because they're not human. So if privacy and objectivity are important, then often they will be more effective. But if we require empathy or complex social understanding, that's better handled by humans because, again, AI lacks that emotional depth and contextual awareness. So one example of this is that one study found that people disclosed 11.5% more sensitive information to an AI agent than they did to a human doctor. Just because they were dealing with a human, even though it was a doctor who was, expert in the particular needs and medical needs in that scenario, they were more comfortable if it was sensitive or embarrassing, disclosing it to a neutral bot. And then the final one, this won't be so surprising, I think, potentially to you, but, optimizing repetitive or high-level tasks, better done by a bot, could do it more effectively, more efficiently, at greater scale. But when trust and emotions are more critical in that interaction, like, for example, sales context or, investment advice, then that's still much better coming from a human. Because of that lack of emotional capacity and moral judgment from AI, it reduces guilt, and our guilt prevents unethical interactions. So human-like AI can counteract that by building stronger emotional connections and encouraging more ethical behavior. We've seen this in the context of fraud. But, for example, if you use an overly cute avatar, so something like big eyes and cartoon-like for a bot, in a trust scenario, so if you're giving financial advice, for example, that just translates to a reduction in the perception of competence. And that's really obviously important when we're giving financial advice. Customers, for example, in one study were 24% more willing to follow the advice of a virtual sales assistant if they used an avatar that was not cute and relatively neutral versus one that was cute. So to build trust, if you're going to be using an automated system, you need to highlight the competency and reliability of the assistants. For example, highlighting that it's using verified expert data. And people are more likely to trust those virtual sales assistants if it signals professionalism and relatability by being friendly, reassuring, and clear, and not being overly cute, as I mentioned. So, it's that combination of human and AI, what is often collectively known as agentic AI, that really offers the best solutions for us. And, it's a bit of a buzzword these days, but when we talk about agentic AI, to my mind, that's really all we're talking about, is about the two things working in partnership to deliver the best solutions. How we apply that, and just a few use cases in Concentrix very briefly. I'm not going to talk through in detail. And is about being, human-centered and tech-powered, as I say. So at Concentrix, we have tools like GenAI content readiness. This is making sure that the content that a GenAI tool, like a large language model, is learning from, the content has been created in a way where it is easily read, giving the right answers, and not contradictory or lead to hallucinatory outcomes. And we have a team that specialize in doing this and have improved accuracy, readability of the outputs as well as the inputs at scale. We have IX Hero, which is effectively an agent assistant for customer-facing staff, and that enhances customer engagement with these virtual assistants that can provide 24/7 support, resolve queries, and personalize the experiences for the agents. We have IX Hello, which is basically a large language model, but is trained specifically on the data we want it to be trained on, the ring-fence data that's specific and unique to the brand, so that it's not pulling stuff from the wider internet, which will often be inaccurate and can lead to negative outcomes, like the DPD example that I shared a minute ago. And we have Polyglot, which is a real-time translation tool. What the particular value of this is, it ensures that the language that the agent is using and the language it's using to interact with the customer are the most effective ones to lead to the best outcome. And there aren't, if they're operating in a second language, that the next best actions they need to take, for example, are explained as clearly and as simply as possible in a language that they best understand. So those are just 4 examples. There are many more that are being built within the business at the moment. In terms of how to apply, these agentic AI solutions, one of the things that we're working on, and this is an example specifically for banking, financial services, and insurance, is creating these kind of future state models, which show where the use cases are for advisors, AI, or a combination of the two. And as you can see for this one, for financial service, banking, financial services, and insurance, this value map shows different functional domains or customer journeys for different areas, like fraud detection. You can see there marketing campaign development, customer onboarding, and what it identifies is the particular points and the crossover points between them, a bit like a tube map, as you can see, where we can use these agentic AI tools most effectively. So you'll see that advisor and AI is pretty much the solution across the board. But there are some examples where, for example, with identity verification, it applies across many functional domains. And so you could have the same advisor supported by an agentic AI working across all of these different journeys in terms of claim processing, customer onboarding, payment and fund transfers. The identity verification tool could apply and be used across all of those different scenarios, but with a agentic AI offering a better solution for the customer, but also for the organization as well. And these value maps are hugely valuable in helping us identify what tools to use and where. And love to talk to you more about them if you're interested. So to conclude, the overall summary, I guess, of all of the research that I've done, both in informing my book and the work that we've done at Concentrix, and what we found from all those client engagements we work on, is behavioral science is best used to augment generative AI. It's not, we often talk about, with any form of technology, people think of it in terms of what it does that humans currently do and how we can replace the humans in our business with these tools. That's not the way to look at it. It's about creating solutions that work for the human customers that we have, as well as for the robots, and combining the two. So, as I've demonstrated, hopefully today, the behavior business, when I talk about that and what I talk about in my book is, Influencing behaviour is critical to any form of business success. So understanding the key tenets of behavioural science is fundamental to that, and is critical to creating great experiences. And as we've seen, the techniques can be relatively simple to apply. You need experts to do it, but they are simply applied, and we don't find too many barriers to doing that, but they can be incredibly powerful in the impacts they can achieve. And when we're moving into a world where we're increasingly making use of generative AI, it's creating technological problems we need to solve, but it's also creating new human problems. We know about accuracy, truthfulness, and hallucinations. Every time you've used ChatGPT, you probably had some experience of this and seen it. But it's also magnifying the behavioral biases that influence our behavior. And fundamentally, we have less trust in AI. These tools, can perform certain low risk transactions for us, but when we get into the more high risk domains, we trust them less, and that can lead to increases in fraudulent behavior and negative outcomes for organizations. But your customers remain human, so it's that understanding that's critical to understanding how we can best apply them. And the best way to apply them is about helping and not replacing humans. So to successfully harness Gen AI, you need to recognize the use cases where it's not appropriate. Those transactions where creativity and empathy are more critical, where trust is really fundamental. We need to identify the biases in the existing data. Are you training your tools in the right way? Are they reflecting and adapting based on these biases? And it's about enhancing and augmenting the humans in the business, not replacing them. As I say, humans and AI working together, agentic AI in other terms, is really where we can achieve those win-wins. So thank you very much for listening today. Hopefully you've been answering questions in the Q&A as we've been going, or asking questions in the Q&A that I've been able to answer as we go along. If you're interested in learning more, here's a bit more information about Concentrix. Please do get in touch. But also, there's a white paper I wrote last year about Gen AI and behavioral science, which talks in a bit more detail about some of these challenges. The QR code on screen will allow you to download that. And I'd love to hear from you. If you want to get in touch, please do feel free to reach out. My details are there. And thank you, and look forward to speaking to you again soon.